We will start our last session for today. But before we do that, I would like to make one announcement. It's connected to our previous session, the one on Algeria. There is a newly coming up book for Dr. Yahya Zubair. The book is The Politics of Algeria, Domestic Issues and International Relations. The book is going to be published by Routledge. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting book. Dr. Zubair is sitting among us. Please, if you are interested, you can find Dr. Zubair. He'll tell you more about the book. It's going to be connected to the discussion in our previous session. This session, before you, this session is going to be about military politics and democratic transitions. We have 4 panelists with us. Dr. Jose, Dr. Rafael, Dr. Muhamad, and Dr. Shir. And for this session, we have Mr. Üveys Khan. Üveys is a senior research associate at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs here at Sabahattin Zaim University. Üveys is a PhD candidate in Department of Religion at Syracuse University. He also served as a lecturer at Fatih Sultan Mehmed University. His dissertation explores the theological foundation of modern sovereignty and the ways Islamic political theory and practices can help to resolve problems in modern political theory. Üveys will introduce the panelists here and will take over. Üveys, it's yours.
Welcome. I know this is what they call the nap zone. So I hope you will courageously battle your sleep for this panel. In any case, we'll try to make it as exciting. I don't know if we can compete with Pakistan, but we'll try. Shahristani said that no blood had been spilled more than on the issue of imama in the history of Islamic peoples. And I think for CIGA, we could say the same for Pakistan, I guess. Anyways, we have here a distinguished group of scholars from, now we're exploring a little bit outside of the Muslim world as well. This panel brings together experts on Latin America, Spain and Portugal and Europe, and Indonesia, and Israel and Palestine. These 4 panelists are going to talk about our main issue is the role of the military in democratic transitions, lessons learned, and all of them have expertise in their fields. The first panelist is Jose Javier Olivas-Osuna. He comes from, he's based out of Madrid. Is that correct? I think Madrid, right? I mean, you have such such a cosmopolitan biography. I don't know which one to say. Madrid, London. He leads an interdisciplinary comparative project at the National Distance Education University on populism and secessionism. He also is affiliated with the Conflict and Civil Society Research Unit at the London School of Economics, where he heads a research group on Euro crisis in the press. Jose Javier also holds a PhD from LSE, and he's authored a couple of books on our issue. The first one being the Iberian Military Politics, Controlling the Armed Forces During the Dictatorship and Democratization. The other one is Revolutionary versus Reactionary, which isn't a book. I think it's an article. It's an article that was released earlier this year in War and Society, and we're going to hear more about that article today. I will invite Professor Jose Javier Osuna, Olivas-Osuna, to the podium. The floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. Oh, it's not, doesn't sound. Is it working? No? Can you hear me? So thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and it's a great honor and a pleasure to be invited and have the opportunity to speak about Spanish and Portuguese transition. It is a bit of a titanic task to cover these two transitions in just 18 minutes, but I'm going to try my best. So I'm going to be rushing through some of the slides. A little caveat, I'm not going to use very in-depth academic language. I'll try to make it simple as well, because I assume that many of you are not that familiar with this transition. So I try to be a bit more historical in a sense, okay? This is briefly the plan, what I'm trying to show, a brief background of both cases. Then I will focus a little bit on the differences in the type of tools of control that they were using. And then I will try to give a sense, based from a little bit from historical institutionalism, on what may have caused these divergent or discrepant trajectories of civil-military relations and the utilization of tools of control in each of the countries. And I will throw in the end a couple ideas that you may think may be useful or not for some of the cases that we've been studying this phase here. So just to start, so if you know about Spain and Portugal, you may think, oh, well, these are very similar countries, neighboring countries, similar languages, they have tradition in Catholicism. These countries had, in the time of the transitions, they were not that developed economically either. Both had some levels of illiteracy at that time as well, not anymore. And they had both kind of a past colonial empire. That was important. But most importantly, the transition started after very long periods of dictatorships in both countries. And these were civilianized dictatorships. So we have Salazar, who was a professor from the university, who was appointed by the military to run finance first, and then they saw that he was quite proficient, and they allowed him to kind of rule the country for many years. Then you have Franco, who gained power through a war. So there was an uprising against the Republic in Spain. They won, and he emerged as a leader, and he became the dictator until 75, right? So this is kind of where we are in both countries at the beginning of the transition. So you would assume, like, well, similar countries, so many similarities. So probably the military play a similar role in both transitions, and that's not what happened. So this is kind of the puzzle here is why we have, on the one hand, we have a leftist liberal military in Portugal overthrowing the regime with a military coup, while in the other case, you have a transition that its trigger is initiated by people from within the regime after the death of Franco, and where you have the military actually trying to prevent the transition from succeeding and trying actually to reverse some of them to the previous authoritarian system. Okay, so this is why this is interesting. So big questions we should ask ourselves is like, so why Spanish transition was so successful in the end, right? So we talk about Spanish transition as being kind of an ideal, a model. There was a lot of literature on that in the 80s, in the 90s. And why, on the other hand, why in Portugal transition was not as smooth as we could have expected? No? With the military also pushing for democratization, why it's not so easy then in the end? And then other questions, how did they manage to do so? So I'm not going to have time to cover everything. I'll try to give you some clues, some ideas here and there what happened, and how they managed to consolidate transition to democracy, which is one of the issues here. So I'm not going to go through, this is a chronology that you don't need to know, but just to say that The process starts basically mid-70s, so right after the oil, the oil crisis. So you have the MFA, which is the military, the armed forces movement in Portugal. They do a coup against Caetano, who was the replacement of Salazar. Salazar had some problems, illnesses, and he was replaced by Caetano. And that was what is called the Carnation Revolution. You saw in the picture earlier this iconic image with the rifles with the carnations. And in Spain, 75 is when Franco died. So it's just a little bit later when we start. And then I'll just be briefly summarizing things that happened in these two countries until 86. And people will ask, why 86? Wasn't the transition over fast? It's like, well, because 86 arguably is the moment where we can, with little doubt, consider that Spain and Portugal had succeeded in consolidating democracy. Okay? And I'll talk about that in a second. So let's move to Portugal first. What's so special about Portugal is the military were pushing and shaping transition to democracy. The MFA, they not only did the coup, but they institutionalized themselves. They created a whole set of institutions that mirror political institutions. So they have the MFA Assembly, they have the High Council. They have created a kind of a junta, a Council of National Salvation. Later, they created the Council of the Revolution, which was a military junta overseeing decisions, political decisions, also the military decisions, right? And this period, this transition, can be divided basically into two parts. First is the part of the provisional government, provisional because that was before the enacting the constitution, and after we have the constitutional government period. So why so important the first part of it? It's like, because the first part was kind of an experiment of how transitions could be conducted. So these 2 years, we see a moment of great instability. The first thing is because MFA created all these institutions, these bodies, in parallel. So they created a process of militarization of politics, but also politicization of the military. And that's quite important to understand what happened later. The idea initially, how they justify the need to democratize the armed forces. So they fire some people, they put some people in prison, in particular conservative right-wing military, and then they created their own new institution. The problem is there was fragmentation. The moment they started having political hierarchy, which was a political hierarchy in parallel with a military hierarchy, where you had a low-rank officer with more power de facto than high generals, that's what created a lot of turbulences. So you have factions within the MFA, and you have factions outside the MFA within the military as well, okay? At the same time, one of the things they really wanted to do was decolonize. Because Portugal was struggling since 61, they started having colonial wars, and that was very draining for the government, and that was one of the main sources of discontent for the military. The first thing they did, they said, well, we're going to give away the colonies, the military. But that was a process they had to deal with, people coming back. And you also have in that period, you have what is called the revolutionary agenda. So some of these governments, that provisional government, they tried to push forward a revolutionary agenda, which involved like social mobilizations, seizure of land, collectivization of land, nationalization of companies. But this revolutionary agenda didn't play well from the beginning, and it was actually creating quite problems, not only at the level of business, but also other people. And within the military, the moderates, the MFA were more moderate, they started slowing it down. So you see all the turbulences. And also you have, in addition to that, coup d'etat. So you have first right-wing coup d'etat trying to reverse this revolution. Then you have a left-wing coup d'etat that happened after they slowed down the revolutionary agenda. So just to say that the November 75 coup was a crucial point, a critical point in the transition, because that failed left coup d'etat delegitimized the revolutionary agenda. And that allowed the moderates to take over control. And actually, that led also to the victory of the socialists in the elections next year that were more moderate, and that started to change the way the transition was conducted. But we still create in 76 a constitution, but in that constitution, still the goal was to create a socialist democracy, a socialist democratic state. So still they had the idea of revolution, but a gradual revolution from that point on, right? And they slowly start transferring power to the civilian leaders. After you have elections, before the military were appointing all the government. Now the elections were appointing the government. A military person was still the president. That was important. And the Council of the Revolution had the capacity, and this is important and problematic, had the capacity of veto any major political decision still after 76, okay? On the other hand, then you have this economic problem, turbulence again. Center-right-wing government wins the elections, and with the support of the socialists, they decide to really transform the institutional setting with a constitutional reform that they launched in '82. And that actually abolished the Council of the Revolution, and that was really the moment where the military withdrew from politics. And that's a second key moment there. There were also some reforms, but I'm not going to go through that now. Just move quickly through Spanish transition. So what do we have in Spain? Franco had left an heir. An heir was the king, Juan Carlos, through agreements with monarchic military officers in the 50s, or 40s, sorry. So that was a decision made beforehand. And the king showed willing to transition the country into democracy. So there was a general view in society from Spanish elites that it was necessary to transition. So it was not something, an idea of a few people, a lot of people that were pushing that idea forward. Suarez was appointed prime minister in Spain, and he launched some reforms. What happened is the military were not happy. Mostly the military were very conservative in Spain, very homogeneous group of people. Some of them very radical, reactionary military as well. And they had they have some reasons to be a little bit angry with what was happening. They had to decolonize also Sahara, so that was a thing. But it was minor, but still for the pride, that was an issue. Legalization of the Communist Party. They didn't accept that. They didn't want that. They were kind of fooled into believe that this was not going to happen. It did happen. So it was not well, there's a story about that I'm not going to tell now, but there was also the legal self-dissolution of the regime. So the regime dissolved itself in the parliament. So that's something also unusual, and they didn't like that either. Some of them voted against. And then there was terrorist groups, extreme right-wing terrorists as well, but mainly left-wing terrorists, and they were mainly attacking military people and policemen. So that was a big problem. What happened in Spain, the government tried not to bother the military. They allowed them to say whatever they wanted, to express their discontent. And because the government did not react in a more decisive way, they kept on showing discontent in public. And they started making statements and writing in magazines about the government, we're going to chaos. And so they felt emboldened by the lack of action of the government. And then it's when we had then some conspiracies against the government, right? So you have Suarez, again, they also feel some economic problems in the country, problems to manage the military, he resigns. And the moment when they are appointing the replacement of Suarez is when we have the 81 coup d'etat, the one we saw in the picture, this very iconic image of Spain. So there's some military police enter the parliament and try to seize power. That's also a critical juncture in this process, because the failure of the coup showed, on the one hand, deep commitment of the King of Spain to democracy, because he participated in neutralizing the coup by calling key military people and saying, I'm not supporting this, even though I know you don't endorse democracy, if I'm your commander-in-chief, and you need to do as I say. And using that professional streak on the military, he managed to get obedience of people that were very much against democracy. Then we have in '82 another key moment. Spain joins NATO. And that's something that also started having the military thinking about other issues, not just politics, right? And at the same time, there's a landslide majority vote for the socialists. And that also showed that the society in Spain was not right-wing anymore, was much more progressive, and was not willing to accept a return to democracy. Okay, so these are major factors. So what the socialists did is piecemeal approach. Let's go gradually. We are not going to convince them to become Democrats, but we need to ensure that they obey and they follow the chain of command. So we don't need your endorsement. We just need that you don't engage with that. And then I'm going to mention it a bit later. They started creating a regulatory body. They started clarifying rules to remove power from the military. For example, in justice, military justice was reformed. They unified their branches. They created coordination bodies. Okay? And they managed to change the nature of this content. So before military were focused so much on what happens in politics, into military were so much focusing on what's happening in the armed forces and what do we need to do in order to have a bright future as armed forces. With NATO, with now some growing investments on armament and things like that, okay? So what do we see now? And I'm gonna go just in '86. Both countries joined the European Economic Communities, and we can assume that the transition was consolidated. But let's go a little bit on type of tools of government that they were using. This is very, very brief, so I'm not gonna go in detail. For example, in Portugal, things that they were using coercive power against military. So the first thing they did, they abolished a lot of institutions that were from the regime, but they created very similar ones, just with different political intent. So they were using special forces to neutralize some coup, and then other special forces to neutralize these special forces that have become politically active, and they were actually threatening the democracy. So what's a bit interesting, they even use sometimes civilians in mobilizations against some of the military. Trials, sanctions, so those type of things. Spain, minimal use coercive force. They knew that. Yep. So minimal use of coercive force. Even during the 23rd of February, '81, this major coup, only a few policemen were set up to surround the parliament, but no, it was the military for themselves to accept and to control themselves. Non-coercive power, in Portugal, institutions, the idea first was to politicize the armed forces. So the idea was we politicized them, we made them Democrat, and they would just endorse democracy. But that ended up being creative fragmentation. It didn't work. Another thing they did is, like in Portugal, they tried to use a little bit services and appointments to key positions of personnel. But that didn't have very much of a relevance. It was more important in Spain, this organizational capacity of the state. So they created the ISAF, which is the institute of a social institute for the armed forces that provided health, housing. So that was ways to provide perks for the military. So they could feel like even if they would withdraw from politics, they still have a kind of a decent living, right? They stopped the provision of services in the jobs in the administration. That was one important thing. Before, a lot of military were working in companies, in armament companies, in other type of big corporations, but they stopped that. And then they created the bodies for coordination. And then they put on top of those bodies civilians. And so those were kind of major issues. They also promoted professionalism through training and education. Information, from the point of view of information, Portuguese, they used secret services. A proliferation, there were a lot of different secret services that were kind of replacing the dictatorial ones. They contributed a lot to do a lot of propaganda and censorship within the ranks, within the barracks. In Spain, that didn't happen. Spain didn't try to interfere. Actually, Portugal realized later that didn't work, and they abandoned. But they abandoned to the extent that you didn't even have secret services. They closed those institutions. Spain, on the other hand, they had centralized secret services that worked very well to neutralize the plots. They actually managed to detect them, most of them, before they happened. And autonomy and tolerance. Spain, a lot of autonomy and tolerance at the beginning, very permissive with the governments, but then later they just changed that approach. They appointed liberal, they were still right-wing military, but liberal to high positions, and they also promoted the retirement. So they gave good packages to promote people leaving the old military from the war to leave. So I'm going to go very quickly. Money, they didn't have much money. They tried to reduce the size of the of the armed forces in order to be able to pay more. Still, the salaries were very, very bad, very, very low. So this is a key that a key tool, but they didn't really manage to get much out of it. Just very quickly, I'm going to run through this. Part of it is because of historical legacies, and this is important. This is something I won't have time to cover, but the legacy of the Civil War was fundamental because it set up a kind of self-reinforcing mechanics in terms of homogenization of the composition of the armed forces. They were very loyal to Franco, and because they didn't have money, they had to focus efforts onto the ideas, the values, the victories of the past, rather than on the poor situation they were. So shifting focus from professionalism to that. And in Portugal, it's the opposite. In Portugal, they had the colonial wars where they get in touch with insurgents, and they had to use counterinsurgency. Many of the military there developed caudillistic traits, and they were even endorsing some of the left-wing ideals. And also NATO helped them to do that. Well, very quickly, just some ideational factors, so I'm not going to go through that, but normative dimension is very important as well. It's about legitimacy. They were searching for legitimacy, and they tended to do what they thought it was right. International actors, in this case, didn't play much of a role beyond NATO, because the rest, the US had this idea, let's say, well, let's let Portuguese to collapse, and this is the vaccine against communism, you know? So that was one thing. And then you had, of course, institutional dynamics internally that explain why there was some slowdown things within one or the other armed forces, and the fact that the military lost agenda setting. But the idea, I mean, I'm going to run, this is an explanatory model, you don't need to look at this. Just the key message, this is the conclusions. So the difference in composition of the armed forces that was very much the result of the past. That was key in showing why there were certain tools of control were legitimate or they were available to use. So you cannot use any kind of tool of control with any army. It depends on the conditions. You need to adapt your tools of control to the situation, right? So as I said, different type of tools of control. The coup in 82, in 81 in Spain, crucial, in Portugal 75. You need to take advantage of these kind of critical moments to launch reforms, and hopefully you get also support of civilians by voting and by the support of civilian society if you have some, because this is also very important. And just a last idea, so it's when we try to think about democratization, we think, oh, well, we need to install some new reforms and just to put the right actors in the right places. And that's probably a necessary condition to have the right institutions, the right people. But you need to think as well that you need to cope with the legacies of the past in different ways. So it can be ideational legacies in terms of normative, what's legitimate to do, what's appropriate to do or not. And that's something you need to take into consideration. And also make sure that you take advantage of the political momentum to support any kind of reform that you need to do in your country. And that's it. I think I went a little bit over time. Thank you very much. Sorry for... Just one thing is like, okay, this is propaganda. This is the book. The thing is like, if you want to know a bit more in detail, in particular for students, about the framework and how I operationalize that, I can send you a PDF. So if anyone's interested. It's very expensive. So I will send you don't tell Palgrave. I will send you a PDF copy.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Rafael Martinez, who is a doctor of law and professor of political science at the University of Barcelona, Spain. He's written a number of award-winning books on the subject of civil-military relations. Among them are Los Mandos de los Fuerzas Armadas Españolas del Siglo XXI, Debating Civil-Military Relations in Latin America, Soldiers, Politicians, Civilians, Reforming Civil-Military Relations in Democratic Latin America. He is a very distinguished scholar with us today. I invite you to the podium. Thank you.
Is it okay?
run? No. Well, thank you very much for the CIGA, and especially to his director, Sami Al-Arain, for the invitation to this interesting event. The only reason that I am here with you today is for my book, with David Pionberlin. Moreover, if believe that if you had known that I speak English so poorly, you will not have invited me. Well, in this book, we formulate an important question. When can we affirm that certain armed forces, which have been the political power in an authoritarian regime, have transformed themselves in a nearly irreversible way into an administrative instrument at the service of a democratic state in its society? We seek to know when, why, and how militaries abandon power, become part of the public administration, and attain, in Morlino terms, social legitimacy at the same time that they become rooted in the political system. How, why, and when the probability that military officials might again seek to establish a dictatorship becomes minuscule, and dictatorships should neither be expected nor feared. There is unanimity in the literature about the necessity for the armed forces to maintain themselves politically neutral as a requisite for the consolidation of entirety of the political system. There is nothing in the literature that contains the two words to each other or that makes precise what the socio-political condition must be and which evolution and reform must be made in civil-military relation in order that armed forces may become subordinated and democratically consolidated. For this purpose, we made an ambitious framework and analyzed 4 cases: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. I will try to explain our framework, and after that I will show it the result of these cases. I will not explain every case. The transition and the posterior consolidation are a sequential itinerary when traveling toward democracy. As can be seen in the figure, the one-way route to follow from authoritarianism to democracy demands a whole set of changes of greater or lesser importance, which involve the crossing of 2 thresholds. But prior to overcoming the first of these, while still in non-democratic stage, certain significant changes must be made in the political system. Changes which do not immediately result in democracy, but they are the means by which a country enters into the period of transition. This period is one of openness or liberalization on the part of a regime that is not yet democratic, but which, if progress continues to be made in these reforms and the first threshold is overcome, will clearly orient the political system toward its conversion into a democratic one. Nonetheless, there remains a high risk of regression. A period of consolidation then appears in which the successive legislative, structural, and cultural changes and all types of other changes will function to gradually make the political system become more democratic until it becomes time to cross the second Rubicon, the threshold of consolidation, after which one can begin to speak of a democracy without any apparent danger of a return to authoritarian past. The phase of consolidated democracy thus begins the infinite journey of improvement and optimization of democracy. The studies of civil-military relations were begun with the conviction that the armed forces, even during democracy, constitute a constant danger for the political power and society. This danger, according to Duverger, was weakened by, in first step, the conscription, which insert the society in the military establishment and impeded the latter radical isolation, and second, via the fostering of a sentiment of obedience to the state among the soldiers themselves. Or at Dex holds, military institutions are inherently undemocratic because they are hierarchically organized. Civil-military relation amply much more than this civil supremacy, and of course, much more than the absence of coup d'etat. In this sense, I agree with David Cohen and Orel Krassan when criticized the idea that transition theory lacks a generally accepted analytical concept of dimension, areas, and context of civilian control of military, and large segments of the literature seem to equate civilian control with the presence of a civilian supreme commander and the absence of overt military intervention. This identification of the armed forces with risks seems to be reductionist. The literature has marked out 4 models of civil-military relation, core strategies of coexistence. First, where the military dominates the relationships. Second, where civilians are those who dominate. Third, where there is collaboration between both sides. And fourth, where competencies be divided up among the two. In so doing, we must answer the question of who has the power of decision in this relationship, or how it is distributed. From a systemic perspective, Dan Decker explained to us that the 2 dimensions of civil-military relation are the interaction of armed forces with their society, marking the areas of convergence or divergence and the tension between both, and the interaction of the armed forces with the government, where the control of coercive force is resolved along with the determination of missions and the levels of professional autonomy. Alfred Stepan analyzed how civil-military relations evolved in scenarios involving the end of authoritarianism and the beginning of democratic civil regimes, and proposed a path of redemocratization, a journey during which the military lose prerogatives at the same time that grows their contestation. For us, civil-military relations are also not just a matter of the relation between the military and the public powers. Rather, we hold that the effort should be made to deepen our knowledge of the interaction that should take place between the 3 vertices of the triangle that is formed by the armed forces, society, and the state. What the political representatives do with any administration is management. That is, they determine its structure, its functions, and its mechanism of transparency and provision of clear financial statement. We speak of organization, of strategies, planning, provision of personnel, economic support, efficacy, effectiveness. Even more, we speak about the military. We need to remember that they are citizens and civil servants. As a professional, the military officer is a specialist, offering up his skill to the service of his government and nation. His skills are honored within an institution that puts a premium on hierarchy, discipline, and obedience to command. Military is a citizen who, like all citizens, has rights, freedom, and duties. Thus, certain limits will be placed on the free reign of his liberties in deference to the unique tasks he must fulfill. In order to obtain the democratic transformation of the military and therefore of all the political system, we need to achieve one goal. The goal is to secure their complete departure from political power and the subsequent conversion into a military administrative unit. This will therefore be the route map to follow, but how will we know that has been achieved? What indicators should we look out for? I consider the military officer as a professional and will refer to 3 variables: civil supremacy, military neutrality, and civilinization of the military. Lastly, thinking of the soldier as one more citizen of the country, the final variable be the existence of a civil culture among the military. And these 4 variables have a lot of concrete actions to doing. It's similar to the Narcisse-Serra theory approximation. So, our holistic framework, if everything that we have just spoken of is attained by an administration, it is obvious that it will be legitimized and socially anchor. And we will speaking of an entity in a consolidated democracy. When the public administration in question is the military, when we think of which are the macro goals and that must be integrated in the two spheres of relationship that the military has with, with its society and with the institution of government of its state, we think in 6 macro goals. 3 respond to the objectives that the state requires to the armed forces: reduce military power, devising a new legal framework, building defense institution. 1 is born of the demands that society requires the armed forces to comply with their interaction with the state and society, converging in values, and 2 that arise in institutional and societal interaction, generate defense and military knowledge and effectiveness. As so in the table, the 6 macros are disaggregated in near 30 dimensions in all, and every dimension and progress and tracked as an assessed, it's impossible to read this, of every dimension in known, little, moderate, and substantial. By example, reduce military power, components, external defense, known, military control defense in its entirely. Little, military control defense accepts civil institutional structure without real power. Moderate, military and civil sphere of influence are more evenly distributed in defense. Substantial, civilians control and led on defense with military participation. Police reflect priorities of government and military autonomy fixed by government, but in every case. So, overlying this assessment is a second one. We want to situate these incremental gains within the context of movement from transition. Transition is black to consolidation, gray, and consolidated system, white. This gives us a clearer sense of how well civil-military relation is advancing with respect to the larger political system and its evolution from authoritarian to full-fledged democratic rule. Benchmarks for each dimension do not map onto the 3 phases in precisely the same way. For some dimension, a smaller step will suffice to achieve threshold-like changes. Other dimensions will require giant leaps. There will likely be easier transformation across the threshold for some dimension than others. The integration of both measurements, progress of civil-military relation dimension, and intensity of democratization will generate a table that, after tamely measuring each dimension, will allow us to easily visualize where a country is. Simply put crosses in the different boxes after measure each variable. It's logic. Focusing on the evolution of the 6 objectives in our 4 cases, we observe that Argentina is the country with the highest level of civil-military relation development. Brazil is the less developed, so for that Bolsonaro is not a surprise. C, the reduction of military power and the creation of a legal framework are the most developed goal. So the developing focused at the beginning in the more formal goals, but with that is not enough to talk about democratic consolidated civil-military relation. In each macro goal, above 2 points, we can speak we are in consolidated democracy. If we focus on the intensity of its democratization, Argentina has 2/3 of its dimension in the phase of consolidated democracy, 67.8%. Brazil has 40% and Uruguay 30% of the dimension in the transition phase, that is without democratic development. Argentina only has such a dimension, one dimension. 90% of Chilean dimension are in the consolidation phase or a consolidated democracy. In Uruguay, the main concern of the military is to maintain their salaries and pension, and that of the government, forget the military. Well, this is the dimension by dimension, the result of Argentina. the result of Brazil, the result of Chile, and the result of Uruguay. Thank you very much. The Latino torture is over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martinez. Our next scholar is Dr. Muhamad Haripin. He is a researcher at the Center of Political Studies, Indonesian Institute of Science, and the author of Civil-Military Relations in Indonesia. The politics of military operations other than war. He has research interests in civil-military relations, military operations, non-traditional security, intelligence studies, foreign policy, and he got his graduate degree from Ritsumeikan University in Japan. Welcome, Dr. Haripin. The floor is yours.
Yes. Put this picture to you.
Let's try something else. Yeah, I know, that's what I'm trying to find where it is.
Yes, it's okay.
This is fine?
Yeah, this is okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Really sorry for some minor technical problems. Everyone is already promoting his book, but since Mr. Üveys has already mentioned my my recent book on civil military relations in Indonesia, so I do not have to discuss it further. So first of all, I would like to thank Professor Sami Al-Aryan for having me here, and also all of his staffs in CIGA, who has tremendously very supportive and helping me to be here in this campus and in Istanbul. So yes, my presentation is about Indonesia, the CMR, in the past 20 years. So before I proceed with my core argument, I would like to provide some background about Indonesian politics and Indonesian security. So first of all, maybe many of you remember that Indonesia used to be under the authoritarian rules. We had President Suharto, or what we call, he was the leader of New Order regime, so from 1966 until 1998. And then in 1997-98, there was economic crisis, not only in Indonesia, but also spreading in Southeast Asia, and that ignited the political crisis. From economic crisis evolved into political crisis that pushed the President Suharto to step down. And then, at that time, during the authoritarian period, the military, or ABRI, we call it in Indonesia, used to be a really hegemonic actor. So they controlled not only political institution, but of course the economic and social cultural sector as well. But once democratization kicked in, Indonesia began to manage the military institutions based on democratic principle. For instance, we are trying to impose some degree of civilian oversight, and the civilian control and civilian oversight. Okay, so we move on to the structure of my presentation here. So please focus on the green boxes. So this is the logic of my presentation here. So first of all, we have this, of course, two prominent actors, the civilian community, but I will focus on the elected executives, the presidents who Indonesia applies a presidentialism. And then on the other side, we have the Indonesian military, particularly the army, the most powerful in terms of political power and number of personnel, units, weapon system, and etc. So we have this different development in these two sectors. On one side, we have this regular peaceful political succession, if we can call it like that. So we already have 5 national elections from 1999 until April 2019, this year. And also we have a local election numerous times from 2005 until last year, 2018. So, but on the other side, we also see that the military in the post-authoritarian setting remains consolidated, and then their corporate interests also remain solid, undisturbed. So why is that the case? Why the military seems to be powerful, not explicitly or not in the forefront, but they remain the highly influential political actor in Indonesia. So the first problem is because the partial reform that was implemented during the early years of democratization. So from 1999 until 2004, we have various regulations on security sector. For instance, we have the law on national defense, law on national police, and then law on national armed forces, etc. But the implementation is another issue. And then we also see the remnants, the authoritarian legacy which still exists until nowadays, what we call the territorial command. So this is basically the army command unit all over the archipelago of Indonesia. So from the provincial level and to rural level, we have army units. So this territorial command used to be the political machine for President Suharto in suppressing the dissidents and in conducting business affairs as well. And this unit or these structures remains up until now. So basically, in the body of discipline of Indonesian politics, the problem of military has been circling around the the argument of military politics. So we are talking about army factionalism, the relationship of army unit or army generals with particular CSO, not CSO, but politicians, or the army relations with some militia groups or vigilante groups, religious-based groups, and etc. What I'm trying to do now is my ongoing project is to trying the military dynamics through their own eyes. I mean, I would like to unfold the relationship of military politics and the threat perception of the military actor. So I'm really taking inspiration from a study conducted by Michael Dash and US scholars. He writes about the external internal threats and the relation with the effectiveness and etc. And also I'm taking inspiration from the study of Alfred Stepan, Huntington, and etc. So what I do recently is I'm taking similar approach with Professor Akilsa. So many interviews with officers, active or retired officers, talking with them about the national security, about what their view on politics, on democracy, human rights, and etc. And I also dive into the many documents, open documents, or there are also some secret documents, closed documents. But mostly we already have 3 defense white papers published in 2003, 2008, and 2015. So it tells a lot about the Indonesian military outlook on various strategic issues. And then, of course, official pieces or op-eds written by army generals or some high-ranking officers. Well, the result is I mean, quite predictable. The result is, like military in other post-authoritarian countries, remains highly domestic. They are really digging into domestic-oriented missions. But the next question is, what does it affect or influence their civil military relation, their relations with the civilian authorities? So based on that questions, this is my tentative finding. So I would be pleased to receive insight, criticism from many prominent scholars here. So so this is the 5 different typologies, if I might call it, of this MR in Indonesia. During the early years of democratic transition of President Habibie, who passed away several weeks ago, this is what I call the transition type. And then the second president in post-authoritarian order is President Abdul Rahman Wahid, or commonly known as Gus Dur, which is the type of CMR is conflictual. And then Megawati Soekarno Putri, or Megawati, the daughter of Indonesian first president Soekarno. And then the 4th president is Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, or SBY. So he got elected 2 times, 2004, 2009, and then 2009 and 2014. The type of relation is compromise. And then the latest is our president, Joko Widodo, or we can call him Jokowi. And the type of relation is compromise leading to regression. So I will explore, I will elaborate about this finding. So the transition. So the transition is happening during the President Habibie. At that time, Indonesia was in really chaotic situations. Social conflicts, interreligious conflicts erupted in several regions in Maluku, Aceh, Kalimantan, Borneo, and etc. East Timor, I forgot to mention also East Timor. And on East Timor, interestingly, President Habibie took a really interesting approach that he agreed to conduct a referendum in East Timor. And at that time, military was powerful in terms of political and strategic position. And given this turbulence in domestic level, military was able to mobilizing the troops without a public consultation with Habibie or parliament. And yeah, the personnel were deployed in the conflict regions quite easily. And then during the second type conflicts is happening during the Abdurrahman Wahid presidency. He was the first democratic elected president in post-authoritarian Indonesia, because Habibie was the Suharto vice president, and then when Suharto stepped down, he gave the mandate to Habibie, so there is no election. But Gus Dur or Wahid was elected by the member of parliament in 1999. But he was impeached in 2001. The reason is because he was attempting to introduce or initiate reform within the military. For instance, he tried to abolish the territorial command that I mentioned earlier. Of course, the military was unhappy with that plan, and at that time as well, military had the military the military camp within the parliament, both in national and parliament and local level. So at that time, military was of course a veto player in the decision-making process within the legislative body, and they agreed to push the military, push the president out of office. And then also this initial initiative from Wahid had bad consequences for the military reform agenda, because rather than depoliticizing the military was becoming stronger and consolidated at that time, because they knew the civilian was trying to impose and was trying to reducing their privilege. And the third presidency, Megawati's Corner Putri, what I call the negotiation type of CMR. During this time, we are witnessing, thank you. We are witnessing the rising escalation of vertical conflicts in Aceh, in Papua, and of course we cannot forget the first Bali bombing on October 12, 2002. So this series of turbulence or security disturbances has prompted the military to play a bigger role in domestic setting, and also strengthen their domestic threat perception. They think that Indonesia is a fragile country, consists of various ethnic groups, so therefore the military is here to protect the country from any threats internally or externally. And at that time, Megawati basically did little, not to say did nothing, but did little to initiate control or to impose limitation upon the military activities in political scene or in military operations. And then we are moving to the next type, which is compromise. It's happening during the Yudhoyono period for 10 years. So what we see during his period is that we have this what one observer called a peace dividend, because in 2005 is the end of Aceh conflict. We have a Helsinki Agreement. Maybe many of you still remember about that Helsinki Agreement, and there is no internal conflicts at that time except in Papua. And during that time, SBY was introducing international norms, or he was trying to expose the military with international missions. So, for instance, during the SBY, Indonesia is becoming, or up until now has been among the top 10 UN peacekeeping troops contributing countries. And then Indonesia has been also active in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief agenda missions in security in Southeast Asia, and etc. But on the other side, we see this patronage politics come into play during Yudhoyono administrations. He appointed his allies in strategic positions. For instance, his brother-in-law was appointed as the army commander, and many of his subordinates become the commander in provincial or regional military unit. And in terms of threats, of course, there is no change, even though this international or the international mission, and then exposure and etc. But the threat perceptions remains highly domestic. And then the last administration is the current president, President Joko Widodo. This is what I called compromise leading to regressions. So why I call it regression? Because during his first tenure, 2014 until 2019, we've seen the rising involvement or the rising deployment of active military officers in civilian positions, and then the administration also assigned military officers in various developmental projects. So, for instance, the army is really highly involved in the infrastructure projects, so like building roads, building bridges, and etc. But on the other side, also we are witnessing the rising threats of terrorism, suicide bombings. For instance, last year we had these huge attacks in Surabaya, East Java, where one family attacked 3 churches in Surabaya. So this became the main feature of CMR during Jokowi period that led me to conclude that the CMR in Indonesia nowadays is deteriorating. Okay, to conclude, to conclude my presentation is that I would like to emphasize the inward-looking and domestic-oriented threat perception of Indonesian military. So even though democratization has been running for 20 years in Indonesia, we remain see that the military is only moving a little from its initial position during the authoritarian regimes. Their perspective, their point of view about security, about national outlook is highly domestic, and then it influenced the CMR in general. So the civil military relation in Indonesia in current period is I think is really deep problematic situations, and this is not my task to predict or to provide insight of what will going on in the future, but let's see what our presidents Joko Widodo and the military will do in the next year. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Haripin, for your insights on Indonesia. I would like to call up our last panelist, Dr. Shir Hever, who got his PhD from Free University of Berlin, and his dissertation was on the privatization of Israeli security. His research interests include privatization of security, global arms trade, Israeli arms trade, and the security sector. He will speak to us about the crumbling Israeli-Palestinian security coordination. Currently, he is a journalist for the Real News Network and an independent economic researcher. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for CIGA and for Dr. Sami for inviting me today. And I also want to thank the audience for your courage in sustaining and staying awake until the very last session of the day. So I will try not to take too much time and not let you fall asleep. The topic of security coordination between Israel and Palestine is not exactly connected to the overall topic of this meeting, and I would actually be very happy to talk about civil-military relationships within the Israeli political system, but I think maybe the issue of Israel-Palestine is relatively well known. And maybe in the issue of security coordination, I should say, there is more opportunity for me to say something new and that could increase some of the knowledge here. But let me say, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation for you. I only have this one picture. And I'm very proud of this picture because I had to look through thousands of pictures and also to explore myself the West Bank in order to find one image in which you can see the security coordination between Israelis and Palestinians. For those of you who don't know the uniforms very well, what we see here is a scene in a checkpoint where there is some kind of protest, and the Israeli soldier on the left is telling the Palestinian security person in the center who must be arrested. And then you can see the Palestinian jumping to arrest the person. So this is a very rare picture. I could not find another one. I could find some pictures where Israeli and Palestinian security forces were shooting at each other. But this is not really reflecting reality. We're talking about 25 years since the signing of the Oslo agreements and the establishment of the security coordination. If we look in this entire period of time, we can find maybe 2 or 3 months maximum in which there were conflicts between the Israeli and the Palestinian security forces. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the rest of the time, there is coordination happening. It's just done very quietly. And it's done in a very clever way that the Palestinians and Israelis will not appear in the same frame of the camera. Every time the Israeli forces invade to make arrests, for example, in Area A of the West Bank, in Ramallah or so on, the Palestinian security forces will disappear like magic. And therefore, they cannot be found, there is no confrontation, and we cannot take a picture. Okay, let me start a little bit with what is the security coordination, a little bit of history. We're starting with the Oslo agreements, like I mentioned, which were negotiated over a long period of time. It's a very long text, more than 1,000 pages. And in that text, if you read it, it doesn't look like a peace agreement. It looks like a contract. And to use the theory of principal agent theory, it's very clear who is the principal, who is the agent. The Israeli government is the principal. The Palestinian Authority is undertaking a project on behalf of the Israeli government. And most of the text in this more than 1,000 pages of agreements is about how the Palestinians are going to make sure there will be security for the Israeli side. And then it starts to read like a normal privatization contract. Privatization of security. When you, I've read several privatization contracts, and where you have a clear distinction of who has what responsibilities. One of the things that really jumps to you when you know how these contracts look like, what you're looking for, is the so-called step-in clause. A step-in clause, which you will see in most privatization contracts, is a clause whereby the principal, the government, can say, we are not happy with what the agent has been doing. We are now going to step in and take over. So if, for example, a private company is taking over a hospital or an infrastructure project, a road, a power plant, as a part of privatization contract, there would usually be a step in. The government can say the company is not doing its job. We are going to take over the project and manage it directly. In the context of the Oslo agreements, there is a step-in clause, and it's called the hot pursuit clause. Hot pursuit means that if there is a situation in which the Israeli military says we need to chase somebody, a terrorist, yeah, according to their definitions, and there is no time to negotiate with the Palestinians and to make sure that the Palestinian security forces will come and arrest that person in their area of jurisdiction, then the Israeli army can go into Area A. Area A, defined as the area in which the Palestinians have security jurisdiction, or into the middle of the Gaza Strip, which was also defined as Area A, and make the arrest themselves. Over the years, we've seen that this idea of a hot pursuit has been a very common term that was used by the Israeli military very frequently, and it's happening all the time, even when they want to raid in the middle of the night to confiscate computers from some kind of human rights NGO. This is called a hot pursuit. They could have, of course, asked the Palestinian security forces to do it for them, but I think there are many reasons why they don't ask them. Okay, so also I want to say something about colonialism. because I think this is also an appropriate theoretical framework for us to discuss this. We've heard in the last 2 days talks about countries that are post-colonial, so colonies that have gained their independence, whether it's, for example, Pakistan or Algeria. I've also heard about countries that have lost their colonies, like Spain and Portugal. But here we're talking about a situation where colonialism continues. And there is a lot of writing that talks about how colonialism functions, and then the idea of security coordination is framed in this literature by scholars such as Ilan Pape, Nadia Nasser-Nejab, Omar Jabari, Salamanca, and many others, as a tool for colonial domination, a tool that allows the Israeli government to continue to extend its colonial rule over Palestinian territory through this security cooperation. I think it's the most clear from the quote from Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, who tried to explain to his own cabinet why security coordination is so important, why do we need a Palestinian Authority, and he said, we need somebody to take care of this territory without the interference of the High Court and without the interference of B'Tselem. B'Tselem is a very famous human rights organization in Israel that criticizes the Israeli military. So Rabin was saying, somebody has to do the dirty job for us. That would be the Palestinian Authority. From his point of view, it's very clear what he wanted to achieve and also for what purpose. He wanted to extricate the Israeli military from its colonial policing role in order to make the Israeli military ready for a conventional war, which is what he preferred that the military will do. He failed, but that's not our topic for today. But what we can see that as a result of those agreements, the Palestinian security forces grew very rapidly. International funding started to flow in, mainly from the United States, which specifically for the security budget of the Palestinian Authority. The forces grew very rapidly until 2006, where we have the split between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and then we can see a decline. The Palestinian forces in the West Bank are not as big as they used to be, not as legitimate as they used to be, and the Hamas party in Gaza now has a different security apparatus which doesn't conduct security coordination with the Israeli forces. Now I want to move to the contradictions in the security coordination, because the title of this talk is the Crumbling Security Coordination. And I think if we're talking about coordination between occupier and occupied, then the question really is, how is it even existing for one day? Why should the occupied agree to coordination? I think it's clear enough from what I said so far what is the reason that the Israeli side wanted it. Yitzhak Rabin wanted it. But from the Palestinian side, it's not so clear. But I think we need to understand that as well. And I think here I want to go back to the colonialism framework, because there's more than one kind of colonialism. And the theory of colonialism talks about two major types of colonialism: classical colonialism, for example, British colonialism in India and Pakistan, and settler colonialism, like, for example, the colonialism in Algeria. It's not exactly the same type. And the literature on colonialism in Israel-Palestine is almost unified, almost homogeneous, by saying that this is a case of settler colonialism. So what is the big difference? The big difference is that in a context of settler colonialism, there is no place for the native population. The native population is marginalized and is pushed out by many ways and not included in the labor force, for example. So here, since we have the honor of having Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool with us, I wanted to mention that your colleague, Ronnie Casriels, wrote a chapter in Ilan Pape's book specifically about what is the difference between the colonialism in the apartheid South Africa context and the colonialism in the apartheid Israel-Palestine context. And he says, well, the big difference is that in South Africa, the black population had a role within the system as an exploited labor force, which actually served as a contradiction into the settler colonialism framework, and also contributed to the fall of settler colonialism in South Africa. Well, in Israel-Palestine, the workforce, the Palestinian workforce, is very marginalized. It's not as included as in the case of South Africa. However, security coordination does create a role for Palestinians within the Israeli colonial structure. And so it actually does create an internal contradiction within the Israeli colonial system. I think Yasser Arafat, Chairman Yasser Arafat of the PLO, when he negotiated the Oslo agreements, he understood that very well. He understood that Rabin wants him to be his subcontractor for security, but by accepting this job, he's making a crack in the Israeli colonial system, and he's creating a place for Palestinians to start to play a role within the security structure imposed in the whole territory, and that will eventually make the Israeli colonial structure start to crumble. And I think in that sense, he was correct, although from the very beginning, this security coordination was under attack, both by inside Palestinian society and inside Israeli society. The unpopularity of the security coordination in the Palestinian society cannot be overstated. There is so much written about that, and I will not bore you with too many examples. This kind of critique comes from the left and from the right. Of course, the Hamas party is saying the security coordination is almost turning the Palestinian Authority into traitors. The PLO itself, of which President Mahmoud Abbas is the chairman, has made a binding decision to end security coordination with Israel, which Mahmoud Abbas chose to ignore. And also, of course, from the left, the political parties are saying that the Oslo agreements themselves have become tainted by the security coordination, and that only proves that they should be rejected and renegotiated, and liberation has to go through a different strategy. So we have all this criticism. The answer of Mahmoud Abbas to all this criticism was that the security coordination is sacred. He used this word sacred, and because we are all now in the framework of a conference that deals also with theology in Islam, I think it's interesting that he used a word taken from the vocabulary of theology. Don't forget that point. From the Israeli side, I think it's also interesting to look at the debate about the security coordination. From the beginning, the biggest resistance to security coordination from the Israeli side came from the colonists, or how they are sometimes called the settlers. Yes, these people who promote the continued colonization of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This was already still in the days where there were also Israeli colonies, illegal Israeli colonies within the Gaza Strip, and there were demonstrations against the Oslo agreements all over Israel, and these demonstrations were very vibrant and active, and they culminated in the assassination of Rabin. So they were quite a movement to be contended with. And the most common slogan that was shouted by the protesters was, "Do not give them no guns." Now, I imagine most of you are not really interested in Hebrew literature, but you would not necessarily know that "Don't give them no guns" is actually a quote from a title of a very famous poem that was written by the most important national poet of the Zionist movement, I should say, Natan Alterman. And his poem, "Don't Give Them No Guns," is a poem against war. It's a poem for peace. And it's strange to hear the colonists using that as their slogan. And a lot of people in the left in Israel said, how can they use this anti-war poem in justifying the colonization? But I think it's very, first of all, Natan Alterman himself was not really a pro-peace person. He promoted the annexation of Palestinian territory. But this is nevertheless an idea that for these colonists, they really represented settler colonialism. They said by allowing Palestinians to arm themselves, the whole domination structure will collapse. And it's true, the Israeli government never gave guns to the Palestinian Authority. The guns were given, or not given, they were bought with money, and the money was given by donors from other countries, and the guns were bought from other countries rather than Israel. Nevertheless, that was the slogan that they were used. But in the more recent years, this opposition to the security coordination spread far beyond the colonists. It has spread into the ranks of the Israeli populist right. The populist right is not representing just the colonists, but also representing, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister. And now we start to see that the Israeli security elite, and here I'm referring very briefly to the elite theory of C. Wright Mills, for example, that talks about different elite groups and the struggle between them in order to understand how policy is formulated. So in Israel, you have the security elite of senior generals, commanders of the secret police, of the Mossad, and so on. They are the biggest proponents of the security coordination, and they also use a theological language to justify it. They also tend to call it sacred. But I don't think that the Palestinians who call the Palestinian security coordination sacred, like Mahmoud Abbas, is referring to Islam. And I don't think that the Israeli security experts who are referring to the security coordination as sacred are referring to Judaism. I think they're referring to the theology of security itself. They are both following the same religion, the religion of security. But both of these groups are becoming weaker and marginalized within their own societies. In 2018, we saw a Minister of Defense in Israel who was himself against security coordination. This was the first time that you have a Minister of Defense, Avigdor Lieberman, who says the Palestinian Authority are terrorists, we have to end the security coordination. But the generals wouldn't let him. I want to conclude just by saying that I think these internal contradictions that we see within the security coordination have become unsustainable. In two cases, we've seen a direct confrontation between the Palestinian security forces and the Israeli security forces in 1996 and in 2000. Those are the only two cases in which these forces came against each other, and in the end, trust and cooperation was restored slowly and after much effort, but I don't think a third time is possible. And I think now that we see a financial crisis of the Palestinian Authority, which is a result of many factors, and I don't have time to go into them, and we see a social and political collapse within the Israeli side, which no longer is able to sustain a kind of rational policy in which the security elites can dictate security policy, but instead you see populist politicians dictating security policy instead and pushing aside the security experts. That means that the security coordination doesn't have a future. It doesn't have a majority support neither in the Israeli nor in the Palestinian societies. And without it, I also think that the entire mechanism of the occupation is unsustainable. Without security coordination, the Israeli military will be in a position where they have to go into the cities and start to manage the schools and the hospitals. They're not going to do that. Instead, what is going to happen is a collapse of this kind of colonial regime. And that is something that makes me at least optimistic, but only if you agree with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of our panelists for their great insights. I will take a little bit of my position as moderator to ask a couple of questions, and then I'll open it up to the floor. We have about 30 minutes. We have an hour. Oh wow, we did well. Okay, we have an hour, so I have time to ask my questions. Let me begin by saying that I come from a family that is Indian by origin, Muslim Indian. I grew up in the States. I live in Turkey, and I have Afghani blood. So that makes me a very confused person. But it does give me the ability to ask good questions. So I have that. I can't give good answers, but I can get good questions out of that. So let me begin first by trying to, I'll start with Professor Jose Javier's talk. One thing that jumped out from your talk to me was the way that the king played this very crucial role in Spain. And why that strikes me, and so I'm going to ask all of you, because you know, some of these papers didn't have to do with the Muslim world, but I'm going to ask you to be a little comparative. So why that jumps out to me is because, you know, what are deemed the counter-revolutionary forces in the Muslim world are monarchies, right? But in Spain's case, it seems like the monarchy, the existence of the monarchy was the exact institution that was able to rein in the military. So I wonder, is there any potential for monarchy in the transition from an authoritarian regime to democracy? And then also what was interesting was in the Portugal case, it seemed like the army kind of, and maybe I'm not so familiar with the history, so you can correct me. But what I got from your talk was that there was a leftist coup and then there was a rightist coup. So again, the question is there a role for the military also in this transition to civil, like from military to civil? I mean, those two things really jumped out to me. For Dr. Martinez, your framework was very comprehensive, and I think that we could push that all the way out to like not just the 4 countries that you examined, but we could also do Western Asia, we could do East Asia, we could do the whole world with the framework that you proposed. I mean, obviously we would have to debate theoretical framework, but it seemed pretty comprehensive in the way that you mapped it out. Here's my question: is that the #1 country by your results is Argentina, but then we also know that Argentina came under a heavy neoliberal kind of reform project, you know, with the Washington Consensus and all of this intervention of America into Argentina's economy. Here's my question, is that does the transition to civil government actually secure the freedom of the people when we think about, and now we're talking about democratization, does it achieve democratization in the framework of neoliberal, like capital interventions? So even though we have military regime, we have an authoritarian military regime in Argentina, when we have a performing democratic civilian government, we have like neoliberal intervention in Argentina. So how do we think through those two dynamics? I've heard very little over the course of the conference about the military-industrial complex, and this is kind of for both you and Dr. Jose. Is that, you know, when we look at the Muslim world in particular, we see a very specific dynamic. Like we see these noble guardians who are supposed to protect this founding ideology of the state turn into basically pragmatic shopkeepers who, instead of watching the red lines, watch the bottom line, right? Of you know, the army turns into this whole like economic, commercial enterprise. And I heard very little about that in both of your talk. And I wonder, is that because that was not present in Portugal and Spain or in Latin America, or was that present? And if so, how do you get out of that? Because, you know, when you have a situation where the army are shopkeepers and you've got corrupt politicians, I mean, I really don't see where civilian control really helps out, you know. I know that we had some people in the Pakistan case who were advocating for civilian control, but it just seems like civilian elites are no better, especially given the neoliberal global context. I mean, civilian elites eat up wealth and of the people just as anybody else. I mean, obviously it might be less killing, but I don't know if killing people by poverty is any better, you know. Lastly, Dr. Haripin, I really enjoyed your paper, especially the way that you thought about examining the military's own subjective experience. So, like, you know, a lot of the military we've heard across, they have this very paternalistic relationship to the people, right, and to the state itself. The state needs a guardian. We are the guardians of the state. We will look after the state. And that requires a kind of infantilization of the people, right? In order to, you know, you have to imagine them as babies, right? Like, they're fragile, like, you know, they don't know what's good for them. We have to take care of them. here's my point, is that that kind of seems true. I mean, all of these states are pretty fragile. I mean, they're all post-colonial societies, and that's why, I mean, Javier's colonial backdrop is very important. Like, Egypt is fragile, Turkey is fragile, like Iraq is fragile. Like, everybody, all of these countries are fragile, especially given the fact that they have no control over their economy, they have no control over the media landscape, they have no control of the academic, I mean, if you look at all the measures of sovereign control over any of these societies, they have border problems, territorial problems. I mean, why isn't the military's case here something that we should believe in? I mean, it seems like a pretty plausible way of looking at the world. I mean, all of these societies are put together, they're kind of random, they seem like they need someone to take care of them. So the external ability of external actors to intervene, right, actually does make internal threats a problem. So how can we think through that? How can we basically respond back to this martial logic? And lastly, Professor Javier, thank you so much for your talk. And I found it very interesting how we've got the situation now in Israel-Palestine where, the subcontractor has problems with the contractor and he doesn't know whether to keep going or to leave the job. What I want to ask you is how does this security cooperation between the Israeli, what would seem to be security establishment, and the Palestinian security establishment, how exactly do you imagine that civil society plays a role in this? Israeli and Palestinian organizations, how can they play a role in kind of getting rid of colonialism? Another question I had is, what if we looked at the situation in Israel-Palestine as indirect colonization? So settler colonialism is obviously well established in the literature, but in places like India and Pakistan, we had indirect colonization. Sometimes I think in the modern 21st century, especially the way the Americans do their colonial bidding, they have this third world comprador class taking care of their dirty business in places outside of the metropole. So I'd like to hear about those. I'll go ahead and I think we can wait for their responses because we have such a long time. Yes, so
thank you very much for the difficult questions. Indeed, you know how to make difficult questions. So I think the first question about the king, this is very interesting because if you can guess that the left in Spain was not in favor of the monarchy. Before Franco, there was a republic. So the left had forced the king out and started a republic. However, the case in Spain is very interesting from the point of view that it's not that the king was somehow legitimized by the monarchy, but the king, Juan Carlos, legitimized the monarchy. So it was his actions through transition which actually gave credibility to the institution. And people were not expecting this to happen because he was appointed by Franco. Why was his role so important? Because somehow he was a compromise. The military accepted reluctantly transition to democracy because the heir of the dictator was a monarch which was appointed by the dictator. So they didn't see a clean break with the regime. They saw a continuation. They sold them. That's why they got so angry the moment that there was a formal dissolution of the regime in the parliament. Because they said, well, you promised us that we were just continuing with our system, just with the king rather than with the dictator. And that was got them angry. So this moderating figure was key because he embraced the idea, or he was smart enough. I'm not going to judge whether he was at heart a pure Democrat, because he was raised in exile, but well, he's still a king. Yeah. And and kings like to rule and don't like to listen to what people have to tell them to do. But he understood that the future of the monarchy required legitimizing the institution, which had been undermined by the action of the kings in the past as well.
Do you see any future for kings in the Muslim world? Like, could they be separated from a certain security apparatus that is, like, for instance, you know, that could the people, for instance, use the figure of the king in the same way in order to further the democratic process?
I think, I mean, there's some figures even in ex-communist countries. In some places have been trying to revive the figure of the monarchy as a symbol, as a non-confrontational. I think it's possible, but the king or the royal family, or whoever this is going to play that role, needs to have very clear the idea that what they have to do, or if they want to stay in power, so they need to accept the rules of democracy, at least in the case of a society which is kind of ready in a sense, or where there's a majoritarian support for democracy. So they have a lot of incentives to do so, to endorse democracy, but that comes at a cost. So now, for example, in Spain, there's someone in the royal family who's in prison for corruption. So kings need to abide to the idea of saying, well, we are not going to be untouchable. We will be rich, probably, but not as rich as we were before. And we will have to cope with things we don't like. So we will have to rule, or to be representative of the country when it's ruled by left-wing, right-wing, regardless of we like it or not. And that requires an effort from the king himself. And then the second question about the role of the military. I think here you have the two cases in which the military lost agenda-setting power, and were kind of there, threatening democracy, but not really taking such an active role as an institution, while in the other one they were involved. I think it's really important. I mean, you cannot have a transition if you completely know the military, or you just try to do it without taking them into consideration. They may not endorse the values of the first government, or they may not fully endorse democratic value at first, but they're going to be there, and then you need to involve them, and then you need to somehow give them reassurance that their future as an institution is guaranteed. And you need to address their fears. And this is the important thing here. It's also putting yourself, it's like what he was doing. He's trying to analyze transition from the point of view of the military. So what are their fears? If we want to counter, we want them to be obedient, or we want them to endorse our values. First, we need to say, what's the first concern for them? And then we need to cater for that. We need to give them security. We need to give them services. They need to have proper housing, proper salaries. They need to have a pension. They need to feel that they have a role as an institution. And some people say that often you don't have an external threat. You don't need to create an external threat for them. I'm not suggesting that, but you need to keep them entertained, improving their abilities, developing the military capabilities, developing their skills, feeling confident of what they're doing, self-confidence. They need self-confidence. Otherwise, they will not step out. And just the final thing, which it links to what you say about the government or the enterprises, this conglomerate. So this is something we were discussing yesterday. Franco and Salazar gave, in particular, top military officers positions in big corporations in Spain and Portugal. Some corporations are quasi-run by the government, by the military. But this is something that during transition they understood, in particular in Spain, quickly. If you want professional military, which means military that care about the profession and not so much about politics or about the living, you need to kind of somehow extricate them from civilian world in a sense, or at least it's what they understood. So one of the first things they did, it was limiting the number of people appointed outside the military. So what happened in Spain is the military, they were working in the morning in the headquarters or in the barracks, wherever. In the afternoon, they had free time. So most of them had another job in different places, in companies, even in shops. So that's the first thing they started to reduce. So no, now you have, this is your profession. You need to consider that. That comes as a cost. You need to pay them a bit more, right? So they first reduced the ability to do that, or stopped, limited the appointment, and then they banned it. They said, you cannot do the two things at the same time, which was painful, but they actually started giving, as I mentioned earlier very quickly, this institute of ISAF. So this institute was providing services for them as well, because the problem before is that they didn't have enough salary to sustain large families, and also they had large families because the military were very conservative, very Catholic. They have a lot of children, and their wives didn't work, and their salaries couldn't pay for food. So giving them very good health coverage. They paid them the medicines. They give them housing. More than 50% of the, by 85, 86, more than 50% of the military were living in housing provided by this institution. That helped them to feel less the need of going and work in the afternoon, right? Sorry, explain.
Well, my English. Our idea is to make a framework not only for Latin America, but for the Arab Springs, for the Southeast of Asia, for every cases. But we test our framework only in Latin America. The economic dynamic and the military dynamic in the case of Argentina. Well, I have tried to explain how civil-military relation had evolved. What level has done in every cases, but I don't explain why Argentina grown more than Chile, and Chile grown more than Brazil or than Uruguay. Well, this is the last chapter of our book, and we have found a high correlation with the authoritarian legacy, with the ideology of the government, with the center-left and the left grow more, is more quickly, and with the civic culture, in harmony verbal terms, civic culture, the democratic culture of the society. By example, Brazil is the less democratic society of our four cases. It's for that Brazil don't run, because the society don't push, and the government not push. If you know, with the an explanation for the economic situation at the beginning of the 20th century, the immigrants should choose between New York or Buenos Aires. Perhaps who choose Buenos Aires has a great mistake. The second question, the economy. The importance of the situation of the military in the economic enterprise. The principal case of an army as economy actor is Peru. It's not in our study. In Peru, the military has the direction of hotels, casinos, spas, clothes magazines like Zara, blah, blah, blah. In our cases, the only relevant is Chile. In Chile, we have the taxes of copper, taxes of copper. The 10% of the benefits of the market of copper is a free budget for the military at the beginning of the transition. So the democratic parties think we need to change this, but the military don't accept the change. Well, you need gradual phases of changes. In 1995, Lagos reformed. He maintains the 10%, but he said to the military, you need to present a project. And the government say yes or not. Well, the last reform was a reform of Piñera, and Piñera broke the 10%. Piñera said to the military, you need to present a project. The limit to the budget is the 10% of the benefit of copper, but the government has not the obligation to spend the 10% of the benefit of copper in the military transformation. So we speak around 30 years of transition of time this change. If you try to make all the change in 4 years, the experience is Spain. In the Second Republic, the minister Manuel Azaña made a ground packet of a big packet of reforms, and we finish in a civil war.
Thank you.
Okay. If I can rephrase your question, you are asking about the is it the fragility of the society is inherently there, or is it
yeah, I guess I'm asking if the military is dreaming this up, or it's actually there. I mean, from where I can see, it seems like it's a pretty it's a reality. I mean, all of these societies are subject to intervention at any moment, whether it's directly from an outside threat or from an inside instability or actors. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we are looking on Indonesian case, a country that has thousands of ethnic groups, thousands of local languages, and 5 major religions, but of the Islam is the majority. But yeah, of course, it seems logical that the country is fragile since its beginning. I mean, it will be difficult for anyone to unite or to try to secure the country from the west to the east side of Indonesia. But using historical perspective, I can say that not only Indonesia, but if we take a look in general in regional level, for instance, Myanmar and Thailand, which also share similar features of society. They also have hundreds of ethnic groups and etc. If we take a look at the history, there was some civilian mechanism, if we can call it, to integrate the nation. So in this case, what I would like to argue is that the military is often becoming the spoiler actor rather than the unifier. I mean, when something wrong is happening, for instance, in Indonesia case is Papua. We can talk about the Papua. Papua is the easternmost province in Indonesia. They have been struggling for independence since 1960s. And then Indonesian government from the order era until now, democratization, post-authoritarian administration, have been continually trying to integrate politically, socially, and economically the Papuan society there. Any social economic measure has been implemented to de-escalate the conflict in Papua. And yeah, of course, it is logical to also deploy or to some extent the security approach or offensive measures in such troubling area. But our experience shows that Papuan experience and then Aceh's case, the military is more often becoming the one who make things worse in the field. Yeah. So but I think what's more important in our discussion now is yes, the society is multicultural, is fragile. Identity politics come into play in Indonesia in recent years. We see rising discrimination against minority groups, and on the other side, the rising of populism. I mean, populist groups who use Islamic in really literal or extreme version. But if there is something happen, so for instance, political deadlock, and then the military comes in, I would say that would not make things better. and based on our experience in Indonesia, democratization 98 until nowadays, so the society somehow can find some way to resolve their differences and conflicts. So yeah, the question now is how to convince the military to be out of politics, to be out of economic affairs, and really to be a professional actor, as mentioned by Professor Jose and Professor Rafael.
Okay, I'll try to answer the two questions as quickly as I can. I'll start actually with the second one about the indirect colonization. I think, of course, there's a theory of neo-colonization. And I cut out of my talk for reasons of time the whole discussion within the Israeli government between Yitzhak Rabin and his opponent in his own party, Shimon Peres, who did want to create some kind of indirect occupation, a kind of exploitation-based system where the Palestinians will have an independent state, but will actually be under economic control of Israel. But the reality is that this is not happening. And I don't think that the new colonial framework is relevant to Israel-Palestine because the transfer from direct colonization to indirect colonization is also a transfer from using direct force to enforce a domination to indirect force. And as long as the Israeli government continues to rely mainly on its military and on force to maintain its control, there is no indirect, but rather quite direct colonization. There's an interesting game that I think anyone can play if you go to Israel. And if you go to Tel Aviv, you can just look around you, and the authorities were very, very successful in eliminating signs of the occupation and colonization from the environment. So you can imagine that you're actually in Barcelona or in any European city. You look around, you don't see any signs of the colonization around you. But this is only in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is the city of denial. If you go to Jerusalem, there is not one spot in Jerusalem, I dare you to find one, where you can take a 360-degree turn around and look without seeing the colonization in front of you. You will see soldiers arresting people based on the color of their skin. You will see signs in Hebrew and Arabic giving different directions to people. You will see ruins of Palestinian villages or houses that were destroyed or taken over. You will see soldiers in uniform or police officers and so on. It's all around you all the time. To the second point about the civil society, I left that for the second because I think this is a really crucial question and a really crucial issue of civil society. And I think there's a process of learning of civil society that ends up playing the most important role. In the 90s, we saw a civil society that I think made every possible mistake. Mainly what is known in the European circles as people-to-people kind of civil society. Thinking, oh, well, let's imitate the Oslo agreements and have Israelis and Palestinians talk to each other as if they're negotiating small peace agreements between them, and then the occupation will somehow disappear. But this kind of work doesn't eliminate the unequal power relations, it only replicates it. And of course, this collapsed. Then we had a stage of NGOization, where you have a lot of civil society and a lot of organizations that are doing very important work, but within an institutional framework which is based and dependent on foreign funding. And this was studied very extensively by Professor Linda Tabar and Professor Sari Hanafi, how it kind of depoliticizes the society and creates a problem that doesn't lead to democratization, but rather leads to a sector of the economy that wants to see the occupation continue because this is their livelihood. And that is, of course, counterproductive. But in the more recent years, we see a drying up of the well. The donors, especially the European donors, are closing the faucet and there's no more funding or less and less funding. Many of the organizations have either closed down or became volunteer civil society organizations. Now we start to see the difference between NGOs and grassroots civil society. It's not the same thing. The grassroots civil society, they are something very interesting because they're saying, we're not trying to end the conflict. We're not trying to stop the different groups from having disagreements and different objectives and goals, whether it's the Zionist movement that wants Jewish domination or Islamic movements or democratic movements. The point is to transform the conflict from an armed, violent conflict into a political conflict. And this politicization of conflict is what I would call democratization. And that, of course, means changing the whole political system, creating an ability for people to represent their grievances through a political system. That means having equal rights, of course. But this comes from civil society. They're playing the most important role.
Okay, we'll just open it up to the audience. I'll go one shot across, and then I'll come back around. So, Professor Ijaz.
Thank you. I think they were a wonderful session, wonderful presentations. I have a question for Dr. Javier. I was wondering, how come the Portuguese military that you conceptualize as a socialist, I assume it was a socialist, right, the left wing, paved the way to democratization? Because if I have the Chinese case or the Soviet communist military cases, they have a very different conception of democracy, right? I mean, they don't agree to the Western conception of democracy. So how come a military, which you assume as a socialist, is leading to democracy?
Yep.
Thank you. I have just a short question for the fourth speaker. My question is linked to the two-state solution. And the question is, was this project failure, was doomed to fail from the very, very beginning of this strategy? The second question, why the international community and Arab states have been strongly supporting these so-called, two-state solutions. Thank you.
Dr. Sami?
Thank you. I have one question for our first three speakers. Maybe each one of them can address it in a particular way. If I am a person living either in Cairo or Khartoum or Algiers, someone who wants to see change, and I see this is totally closed because of the suffocation of the military and political life. Is revolution, will ever revolution solve this problem, like the Iranian revolution, where they can purge all the colonels and above and start with young officers and go through that? In your studies, have you ever seen something other than that? Is that a possibility? And if that's not a possibility, when you talk about gradualism, and what, I was listening very carefully to Dr. Jose when he's describing, officers struggling with living expenses and pensions and all that. But what we have here is a corrupt military officers who make millions upon millions. And basically what they do is that they enslave the soldiers, the conscripts. And, it's a different class, especially in a country like Egypt, where actually they monopolize the economy, monopolize almost land acquisition. We listened yesterday to a whole list of things. So what do you mean by gradualism here? What do you actually mean by that? Or do you mean, some sort of a political transition within that? But if that political space is totally closed, I would like to hear more about what lessons we can learn from Portugal, Spain, Latin America, Indonesia, and things like that, that could be beneficial or useful to the people who are sitting in these Arab capitals. Are we comparing the same, or are we completely different political space? And the question for Shir, two questions. One is about, I would like to know more about the civil-military relations within the society of Israel, because it looks to me, when you have every single Israeli, maybe, yesterday you told me almost half of them don't serve. But this is basically a military-based society, or somehow every house is militarized, where this particular thing may not be repeated in other capitals, and the whole state has been highly militarized. So how is that affecting the whole structure? It looks to me that, I want to know who's calling the shots. Even a lot of the prime ministers have had military background. So I want to understand that part. The other part is the security coordination, not just with the Palestinian Authority. What about the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, these kind of Egypt. I've heard also that Israeli jets and Israeli helicopters have been helping the Egyptian in Sinai and others. Something that is not being talked about. I don't know if you have any insight into these things, and how is that going to change the strategic calculation across the Middle East as you see it? Thank you.
Why don't we go ahead and start with that, then we'll come back around. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the question. Very interesting. Sorry. Thank you very much for the question. So the one about the left wing, there are two parts. I mean, I'm not sure whether you're more interested into why they became left wing or being left wing, how they, yeah. So they were not, the military were part of a right-wing authoritarian regime, which Estado Novo in Portugal was a right-wing conservative authoritarian regime. The thing is, like, what happened is there was great discontent within the armed forces, in particular when the colonial war started in '61, because they saw that the government had a very idealized vision of Portugal, and they thought they could retain control of the colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, East Timor, by sheer force. And the military, initially they say, well, let's try, but they very quickly realized that they couldn't. The first thing was India, for example, took back the enclaves there very quickly. The military had to surrender it, even though the Portuguese government said, no, we need to keep it. This is Portugal, has always, they used to call Portugal from East Timor until Minho. Minho is a river between Portugal and Spain. So they started feeling that the things that were said within the country didn't resonate with reality outside. And then the second thing, which is very important, is the NATO generation. This is the group of officers that started training with NATO. Portugal was invited to join NATO since the inception of NATO. So not that in NATO they were just meeting or joining left-wing people, not, because military in Western democracies were not very left-wing, but they started seeing things in a different way. And I think that helped to delegitimize the right-wing regime they had in that country. They said, well, what they are telling us here is not good. Portugal is doing poorly, comparatively speaking, to other countries in Europe. This is not working well. And when they were sent to the colonies to defend them, they started entering in a guerrilla wars. Portugal it has very low population, so the wars, the colonization wars, was not big battles with tanks. So it was more guerrilla wars, and they had to do counterinsurgency. So they were so much exposed to the propaganda of the other part as well, and that they ended up becoming socialists. And the thing for them, socialism or left-wing meant a reaction against the government. It's like in Spain, the left was kind of associated with democracy automatically because it was kind of a reaction. So the most radical left military were those that initiated the revolutionary agenda, which is a little bit what Dr. Sami would ask, like, could a revolutionary agenda work? It didn't work in Portugal. It was too hasty. The reforms that were launched were too radical, that even the population were not understanding how the lands were seized or shared, and how the military had a parallel organ of political body and another assembly in addition to the one with the political. So I think those military those that were really committed to a revolution, like Cuba style, or those were the military that ended up even in prison, in jail. So those that did the left-wing coup in November, they ended up in prison. What they wanted is a real revolution, in the sense of having something like in other countries. Like, that didn't work. The moderate, were left socialists, social democrats. Those, they did accept the...
That raises the question of fractionism within the military. Yeah. I mean, is it possible for civil society to play on that fractionalism? Or do we always have to look at the military as a monolith?
Actually, that's very important as well. There was a process of co-option from the political elites. So if you see the military, they were divided in three factions. The MFA were divided in three factions. So you have the moderates that were with very close ties with the Socialist Party in Portugal. The radicals with Vasco Gonçalves, this was associated to the Communist Party. And then they had the populists, so they were associated to left-wing liberation movements like Cuba, and they were associated to very radical political parties, small political parties in Portugal. So, and actually the military, I think by engaging or being engaged by the political elite, the moment that they kind of break the chain of command and they start splitting into political factions, and they found support from the civil society because they had their own internal infight, and that's why they were also using mass mobilization. So the socialist MFA called the socialist members of parties in the north of Portugal to go and try to prevent, for example, some coup against them. So this is a very interesting interplay between the two, and this you need to understand. And I think it was more than being left in ideology for most of these left-wing people, didn't have a very strong view, like trying to create something like China. So it was more moderate. Those that had it ended up arrested. And just very short about gradualism. So, well, this is a super difficult question. So I'm not a consultant. So I'm not sure I can give a very good answer to that. But what we saw is like whenever the government tried to do something a little bit more radical in Spain, which was, for example, legalizing the Communist Party, which is not, I mean, it's normal in democracy, they were legalized, or doing this formal dissolution of the military reacted very badly. So they had to do it one by one and in particular moments. For example, when they legalized the Communist Party, they tried to time it so all the big generals were on a big meeting outside the city and outside, far from the barracks. They didn't want them to react and say, we go now and take so everything was planned in ways that were quite Machiavellian, but it managed to work as well. And I think you need to be patient. So the gradualism is more than, I'm not saying that you need to not to be ambitious in the long run. It's like you need to be patient and you need to be, or what happened to work there is when in Portugal, when they rethought the transition. So they were left-wing MFA, not the moderates even. And they actually wrote a constitution saying we wanted a democratic, a socialist system. But they knew that there were some limits and things that had to be done in steps. And accepting the low-hanging fruit and going gradually, that gave momentum and helped adjust the expectations. Because if you promise something very high, risky to achieve, you may deliver, but you may not. And the moment that you are in a process of transition, you create such high hopes that you cannot deliver, that can pay back. And that may, a lot of transition processes to reverse. Because people say, well, you said that was going to happen in 2 months, and in 2 years we're going to, and that you cannot do. When you see reality, the inertias from the past, the social inertia, the institutional inertias. Anyway, I talk about gradualism, but if you see in the whole process, it was not that long. I mean, Spain and Portugal, you see, it's like 60, 75. It was like 10 years long. It's not that long. A revolution from one day to another, I'm not sure how that would work. I mean, if you are very brutal and then you really eliminate everyone. But in Spain or Portugal, what they did is appointments and early retirement. And that was the way to replace the people that had worked in the war in Spain, for example. So they were super Francoist because they have fought and they have been killed, and they had family killed from the other camp. You need to move them out gradually.
Professor, I think we had a question about, Professor Martinez, did you want to respond? Please.
Well, I try to explain that in our framework, we speak of 3 thresholds. The start threshold, the transition threshold, and the consolidation threshold. The start threshold is the first, and you arrive or with a revolution or with reforms. With a revolution, we have not worked with any case, only reforms. And the reforms are the opening of the authoritarian system. The authoritarian system change, trying to maintain all the power, but arrive the fissure. And with the fissure, the authoritarian regime begin to broke, and the transition start, perhaps. But what happened? We found that every country made his own way. There are not an only way. It's crucial the leadership, and it's crucial the unity of the democratic forces. When you found a strong leadership and unity of all democratic forces, the changes are more quickly. But Linz and Stepan advised that in all the transitions, the military has a privileged position because they are at the bargains, at the agreements of their transformation. They are, in this moment, they are a political actor. They are not one administration. By example, it's very complicated that the police made the agreements of their reforms. But the military, yes, the military are inside all of this. It's for that every country made his own way. But normally is so expensive. By example, in Spain. In Spain, one of the principal problems is that at the beginning of the transition, we have a lot of militaries, a lot of officers, and NCOs, very normal, but no more soldiers. So we need put out a lot of militaries. Who made the first democratic government? One possibility is military, bye-bye, ciao, at home. The second possibility is military, we paid our salary all your life, but you are out. And the military say, well, with this condition, yes. In the budget of the Minister of Defense, we have, it's by example, 100 military, but we pay 300 military. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Sami. Yeah, well, actually, we are asking the similar questions in Southeast Asia. If you are in Bangkok or you are in Noi Pitao, Myanmar, you will be asking the same questions: what they can do to limit the military. And my question, my answer for that is, at least we can. What the Indonesian experience what you can learn from the Indonesian experience is that it is important to impose or to arrange a reformed legal framework during the initial years of transition. So in our case, the contribution of President Habibie was huge in that arrangement. Even though he wasn't supported by the ruling party at that time, but individually and he was getting help from his advisors. He implemented some reform initiative. For instance, the separation of military and police. Because the military and police used to be within the one institution during the New Order regime, and then to some extent also he was trying to demilitarize the civilian institution. So at first he put the legal framework there, the institutional arrangement, and let the next administration implement that. But at least for civil society, we have the leverage that there are regulations that should be obeyed by the military establishment in order to accelerate the reform. That's the first step. And then the second step is, I think it's also important to acknowledge the role of President Wahid or Gus Dur. So I think also it is important to identify the champion of reform. Well, Gus Dur was unique in a sense that he was former largest Muslim organization in Indonesia, Nahdlatul Ulama. Since 80s and 90s, he was already an opponent and opposition figures against Suharto. So once he got elected in 1999, he got strong support from ulama, from the Islamic scholars, also from the media, from the academic community. And also during his presidency, he appointed civilian Minister of Defense, Mr. Mahfud MD. And what interesting is that he was inviting CSO activists, media, and academic community to arrange to formulate the law on state defense in 2002. And that a piece of regulation is important even until nowadays, because it stipulates or it outlines the extent of military mission or position in Indonesian society, normatively, ideally. But yeah, of course, the question is if President Wahid was so good, but then why he got impeached? Well, the problem is that at that time, even though the Indonesian CSO was vibrant, was noisy, but institutionally speaking and economically speaking, they had no enough resources to capitalize their position in order to support President Wahid at that time. So I guess those three lessons that Indonesia can provide to other countries. The first one is it is important to put the legal framework or institutional arrangement in the early or initial years of transition, and then we have to identify the champion of reform that can unite various conflicting parties, even though they are joining the opposition against authoritarian. Of course, many countries also show that once the authoritarian leader step down, this opposition or this the opposition party are fighting among themselves. So it is important to keep them intact after the post-authoritarian period. And the third one is, of course, the role of CSO is crucially, is highly important to make sure that the civilian leadership who got elected didn't abuse his power, and on the other side also to support his reform agenda, if ever had that kind of agenda to control the military establishment. Yeah, maybe I can. Thank you.
Thank you. Before Javier, you get in, because we have 5 more minutes, I want to get one more round. If we have some more time, then we'll begin with your responses. Anybody else before we close the session? Okay, we've got like 3 more questions. Yep. Junaid? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
One question for Dr. Muhammad. The literature on how peacekeeping operations impact military involvement in politics is somewhat nascent and inconclusive. There are cases like Brazil. There are some studies that show that actually has inculcated in the Brazilian military tendencies to intervene in internal security missions. But politicians, you talked about Indonesia and Bangladesh. Politicians that I've talked to or interviewed would say, well, we've kept the Bangladeshi military busy in making dollars, and once the devil is, focused outside, it's not going to prey on us. But we discovered that wasn't true in 2007. There was a kind of technocratic coup by the military technocratic coup. So have you, in your study, or have you seen other research that documents or examines the impact of peacekeeping on the attitudes of the Indonesian military? And quickly, for Dr. Martinez, the model you showed of the kind of transition, threshold, consolidation, how do you avoid the problem of teleology and kind of this determinism that, I have to confess I have not read the full book, so maybe I'm not entirely, this point might be moot. There's a kind of assumed teleology that you kind of get on the transition path, then there's a moment of, or democratic consolidation. I might be wrong, but I just wanted to have a clarification. Thank you.
I just want to remind the audience we have like 4 minutes. I just want to get some questions right before we close. Anybody else? Dr. Louis Safi?
Yeah, my question is for Dr. Hever. Having looked into the Israeli strategy with the Palestinian Authority, do you think that this path of two-state solution is still workable? And what about one-state solution where the Palestinians demand equal rights under one government? And would that, in your review, would change the dynamics in terms of perception, let's say, in many centers of power?
Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, okay.
Yes, thank you all. About the MFA, it's actually very comparable to what Nasser did in the Egyptian. So if Egyptian people want to compare it, they were the same. They did the same actions, and they both failed. What I'm going to shed some light on is two things. One, in Spain and Portuguese, it seems like there were like major events that people didn't control, like COPs, the NATO issue, that affected the transition to be smoother more than other things. And that's something people don't always think about, that being in the European area, after World War II, you didn't need a lot to repress military because they already either going into NATO and the United Nations and their legalizations, or they are already defeated and they need to go under the new terms of the Marshall Project and other things. The other thing is that the intelligence is like, you didn't talk about intelligence at all. From our perspective in the Arab world is that the intelligence is quite military. They work together and they seem to be absent in your, let's say, theses. Is that because there is something different at your side, or you just consider them the same as military, as we do?
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Javier, can you begin first, and then we'll.
Right.
I just want to. I know that it's a little impolite, but if we could keep our answers as concise as possible, so that we could get everybody's answers.
Yeah, I was asked very big questions actually, and in order to address them, I will have to butcher 3 sacred cows, and so I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. I'll start with Professor Tlemceni's questions, and they're also related to your question about the two-state or one-state. So there's a lot of literature about why the world decided to support two states, and most of that literature really condemns the two states framework as a trap in order to prevent Palestinians from achieving their actual autonomy and independence. And I refer you to Haider 8. The new book by Nora Erekat, Justice for Some, is very recommended, Ilan Pape, and so on. But I think most people here in the audience are not going to be very pro-Israeli, but I do think that there is a problem in the pro-Palestinian academic thought and political thought that tends to say that the two-state framework, because it was supported by post-colonial powers, the European Union, the United States, that wanted to have military relations with the State of Israel and wanted to abandon the Palestinians. That means the two-state solution is absolutely wrong, and most importantly, that it's impossible. I think that this kind of thinking is something that, like Dr. Han, you said, it's infantilization of the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not idiots for having tried the two-state process. They had a strategy for that, and we have to understand that within the framework in which the Palestinian leadership chose to engage in the two-state framework. Now, personally, I have an opinion on this. I, many people, think the best solution is one democratic state where everybody has the same right. And I think now there is a clear majority for that within the Palestinian society and a growing support for that within the Israeli society. It's kept quiet, but there are more and more people who are willing to entertain the notion of one democratic state within the Israeli side, surprisingly more among the right wing than among the left wing. But we should not then discount the two-state and say that it's impossible, because that kind of logic, that kind of rhetoric plays into the hands of the Israeli occupation. That means the Israeli occupation can make whatever solution they don't like impossible. So we should say the Palestinians have the possibility to demand, and they have the right to demand, two states, but they choose, many of them choose, maybe the majority of them choose a different solution. That's a different way of presenting it, but that's one sacred cow. Now, moving on to Sami's questions, the civil-military relations in Israel is a topic for a whole lecture, and I could give you many, many books about militarism in Israel, about how the military is so dominant, the prime ministers and other ministers who were generals and so on. But I think it's more interesting not to look at it statically, but rather as a process. So yes, Israel is still a very militaristic society, but it is becoming demilitarized very quickly. That's another sacred cow. This demilitarization process is a result of a shifting of resources and political legitimacy and popular support away from the security elite to the populist right. And the security elite is losing its influence over society gradually, but it's now struggling to maintain that with all its remaining might. And I think that's a very interesting process that we see, that actually Netanyahu, the right-wing populist leader, was very effective in imposing civilian rule over the military, getting rid of the generals he didn't like, cutting their budget, which militaristic prime ministers were not able to do. Even though Netanyahu is right-wing and racist and so on, but it's interesting how he manages to diffuse the military from its sources of power. And I think one of the ways that we see this is, that brings me to your last question and the last sacred cow, which is the coordination that Israel has with other states. And here, my question would be, has this coordination been successful? And I think we can see again and again that in, the governments of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and also Egypt are still trapped in a conception of the Israeli military which was correct 40 years ago. As if the Israeli military is very professional and high-tech and ready to fight. But it has become corrupted. It has become a colonial police force. And it is no longer capable of fighting real wars. The Israeli generals have no experience in real wars. 2 years ago, when the High Commander of the Israeli military, Eisenkot, gave an interview to the Saudi newspaper El Fiyan, the Saudi government pressured him to invade Lebanon. This was around the time where Hariri was detained in Saudi Arabia, and you remember that. And the Saudi government thought that by creating conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, then the Israeli military will march into Lebanon. But the Israeli officers had no intentions of doing that. The Israeli government was not interested. The soldiers were afraid to go up against Hezbollah. So there was no war. And also with Egypt, we see that if you look at the strategic deployment of the Egyptian forces in the Sinai, they are deployed in a very interesting way. Their former enemy, the Israeli military, they put to their back. They build their fortifications with the back towards Israel and the front deep into the Sinai Peninsula to fight ISIS and other forces, trusting the Israelis to guard their backs. But despite of all the Israeli intelligence operations in the Sinai Peninsula, we've seen the attack on the Sufi mosque, where 350 people died. Were murdered. A week before that, ISIS said that they are planning to attack this mosque. the Israeli intelligence could have known that. They should have known that. They should have alerted the Egyptian authorities, and they failed. Where is the evidence of this kind of security coordination actually yielding a concrete benefit for the Arab governments? So I don't think that we can see that because the Israeli military is not so effective anymore.
Thank you. We're running out of time. I'm going to give the floor quickly to both Professor Javier and Professor Rafael and Professor Haripin. If you have anything to say, then we're going to have our awards subsequently afterwards. Thank you.
A question from...
Yeah, I'm saying... You can go ahead and answer those questions, and then we'll finish.
Shall I? Okay, so the issue about whether the environment helped a lot, that's true. And the environment helped a lot. And this actually links a little bit to Professor Sami's earlier question, whether is it just completely different spaces? Or are we talking about transitions in a remote place from our world here? Is there anything we can draw from them or not? Because it's so different, the setting. My intuition is like, I think all transitions are different. Even I was just showing two cases, two neighboring countries with a similar culture, similar regimes, which managed to last for a very long time. So the conditions were, in theory, ripe for democracy much earlier, and it didn't happen. So you need to understand how there's no one single recipe for transition. What we need to understand, and this is why when I was operationalizing that, I was focusing on trying to understand a little bit the tools of control, or try to understand situations, skills, instruments that could work elsewhere, because you're not going to be able to transpose one transition to another. I think we have tried that enough before, and it doesn't work. And one of the things that that came over and over through these couple of days, and I think this helped me also to understand my own transition better. Now going back to Spain, I actually saw a lot of things that are similar, even though the contexts are different. Many of the things I saw similar resonate of how Salazar and Franco dealt with the military. So these are the things that you need to look at. It's not just look at successful transition. Look at how elsewhere a military or civilianized regime dealt with the military, which is also important. But also one thing is when you talk about the alternative. And this is a big thing we need to think about. It's like, okay, so we have the military ruling the country. What's the alternative? Because you have this civil society, but they are corrupt as well, or the military are corrupt. True, but we have plenty of corrupt military in Spain. We have plenty of corrupt elites in Spain during the regime. If you study the level of corruption during Franco and Salazar, this is appalling as well. One thing we need to is like, I guess, or I would be tempted is to try to not to oversimplify these problems. So not all military, even in military corrupt regimes, they are not all corrupt, and the things they do, some of the things make sense. We need to try to identify the things that work as well, not just give a full assessment on the totality. You can, in the end, assess, look, this is not going to work, but you need to understand at least the things that do and work. And the same for the civil society. If we start simplifying the issue and just ruling out alternative because it's saying, like, well, we cannot work with the military because they're corrupt. Oh, this elite in Pakistan is not going to be able to run the economy. That's a problem. And this is what we need to unpack and see and try to become dispassionate. It's very difficult to see, analyze, and try to see the positive or the potential of positive in the other. And try to actually eliminate this othering process, to see this confrontation. It's not just civilians versus military. It's much more complex. They are intertwined, military and the civilians. They rely on each other. And I think this is kind of the last thing I would like to say. So just try to be a bit more, try to refrain ourselves of strong attacks on the other, and try to understand a little bit the positives as well.
There are a lot of types of classification of non-democratic systems. we work with the length classification, totalitarian system, authoritarian system, sultanistic system, and hybrid system. Inside, one of the big differences in totalitarian system, you have ideology. In the authoritarian system, you have mentality. So the difference between the brain or the heart and the skin. Well, if the religion run as an ideology, you have a problem. Why? Because we found that the start of the transition process don't appear in the totalitarian system, only appear in the authoritarian system. So if the religion run as a skin, as a mentality, it's possible the transition, but if the religion is the ideology of the system, it's impossible.
I think we will. Oh, yes.
I will be quick. Thank you, Professor Akilsa. I would be honored if you have time to read my book, Professor, because one chapter is talking about peacekeeping. So my argument is that in contrast with official narratives of Indonesian government and scholars who's working on military transformation projects, so yeah, whose assumption is that military transformation will lead to reform or the military professionalism. My assessment finds that we have really, really considered the timing of that peacekeeping missions occur in Indonesia. It was during Yudhoyono presidency, and what I find is that that wasn't a genuine reform initiative, but instead the peacekeeping norms or peacekeeping mission was an instrument to pacify the military. So in conclusion, I see no meaningful reform result from the peacekeeping. But if you take a look at in terms of weaponries, organization, etc., yeah, of course there are many achievements in that area. But in terms of political, in political sense, I see little achievement in that area. Thank you very much.
Like the heir who was too confident, we lost the race to the tortoise. We went over time. I apologize for keeping you guys a little longer. Dr. Sami, could you please come to the stage in order to give the awards? Thank you for the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'd like to invite Dr. Jose to receive a certificate. Dr. Sami. Dr. Rafael. Dr. Muhamad. And Dr. Shir. And finally, Üveys. Thank you very much, everybody. So with this, we conclude the sessions for today, and we would like to remind you tomorrow we'll start at 9:30. We'll have the session on Sudan and Turkey and our final session, The Way Forward. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Like Secret Service is like a student of him wrote an entire book on Secret Services positions. I forgot to say. I mean, I mentioned that in my book as well. It's just like so much to talk about. There are too many dimensions to the problem. Thank you. No, se me corta el ticket todavía. Otro vaso de agua. De la comida. Nice. Thank you very much. So we'll talk tomorrow more. You know, trip.
Yeah. City sightseeing.
This morning
Yeah.
is our trip. You let me alone. I don't forget.
Is this yours or mine thing? Oh, this is mine. Okay. This is like a defense. It's a weapon. If you get a corner with that, you can kill someone. Eh?
Yeah, you already gave me your card. You already gave me